Good evening, everyone. I'm Troy McKenzie, Dean of the Law School, and welcome to this year's Katzman Lecture. We have really a phenomenal speaker this evening in Gene Sperling. I will talk a little bit about Gene in a moment, but I wanted to talk about Bob Katzman and the idea behind this series. As I think many of us know, Bob was a giant in the law and in higher education, and had a very close connection to this law school over many years. He was a New Yorker, educated uptown at another university, received his law degree at a small school in New Haven, was a law clerk to Judge Bounds on the First Circuit, and then did something that at the time was highly unusual, which is to combine law and political science in his teaching and his research. And when he was appointed to the Second Circuit in 1999, it was in some ways the most natural appointment in the world because he had worked quite closely with Senator Moynihan, closely understood both the courts and the legislative process, and was whip smart. But it was also unusual in that he was someone who bridged the divide between policy and academia. And, but the courts and certainly the law were much richer for his time on the bench. He served as chief judge from 2013 to 2020. And along the way, he had a deep connection to NYU. He taught in our Institute of Judicial Administration New Judges Program, New Appellate Judges Program every summer. In 2011, he delivered our Madison Lecture, which formed the basis for his book, Judging Statutes. And in 2018, our annual survey of American law dedicated its 75th volume to him. And in that occasion, Justices Sotomayor and Justice Ginsburg spoke about him glowingly. In January 2021, when he took senior status, he affiliated himself with our law school even more closely. He was appointed a professor of practice. And one of the things that he had been working on was this series. And his unfortunate passing in 2021 meant that we didn't get to see him fulfill everything that he had in his mind for this series, but we are fortunate that family, friends, and those who knew and admired him had talked to him about the ideas behind it. One of the goals is to, again, bridge law, government, and policy. This evening's speaker, Gene Sperling, is someone who has done that extraordinarily successfully. He is the founder of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. He is a recipient of a law degree from that same small school in New Haven. Along the way, he has also served in important high-level positions in government. He was National Economic Advisor in the White House under President Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and again under President Barack Obama. He's the only person to have held that position for 2 presidents. He is also someone who has represented the U.S. government in a number of forums, including at the World Education Forum in Senegal in 2000. He is a prolific author of thought-provoking works, including The Pro-Growth Progressive, What Works in Girls' Education, Evidence for the World's Best Investment, and most recently, this fantastic book, Economic Dignity, which is a big picture vision of why the promotion of dignity should be a singular end goal by which we chart our economic future. Now, all of that is sort of interesting, but the most important thing about Gene is that he served as senior consultant on NBC's The West Wing for 4 seasons. And as anyone who's worked in government knows, all of the important decisions are taken while walking rapidly down hallways, talking to each other. And like there's a crowd of people in the hallway all the time for some reason. So he is a true Renaissance man of government and public policy. We are going to hear from him for about 25 minutes or so, and then he and I will engage in a conversation. So without further ado, please welcome Gene Sperling.
Now, was it just me, or did you mention my current job for President Biden? So, I would think that it might have been important to note that I am currently senior economic advisor to President Biden, White House coordinator of the American Rescue Plan. But I can also tell that it would not have made a difference to anybody here, since it's obvious by his introduction you are way, way more impressed by the fact that I consulted the fake West Wing for 4 years than that I was in the real West Wing for 14 years. So your reaction has spoke for itself. Well, I'm really honored to be here, and you know, I did do that law school and bar, and even published a few law journal articles. So it is intimidating for me to be here in front of so many of Bob's brethren in the federal judiciary. That is still a big deal for me and for most. Today is, I will note, is 2 days after what would have been the 71st birthday of Bob Katzman. And I know a lot of you are not good in math, but you can probably figure from that it was actually 2 days after the actual 71st birthday of Judge Gary Katzman. I've had a chance to speak about Bob often. You know, he was a very close friend for 40 years. We met in D.C. before I even went to law school. He was a mentor. He was my other older brother. You know, it's an enormous but bittersweet privilege to be asked to give the third Katzman lecture here at NYU Law School. I will say among my accomplishments in life, I consider like pretty close to the best, even almost as good as having a few story credits on the West Wing, that when I got married, Bob performed the wedding, which I realize doesn't make things that distinctive, since everybody I meet, he performed their wedding ceremony. But what you didn't do is have someone in the bridal party that he met and then married. That's just me. We had a little email chain going on Bob's birthday with some people here, and one more notable person, Justice Sotomayor, and we were talking about being Bob's birthday. And of course, she struck the most important note, which is how unbelievably proud Bob would have been of what Jennifer has done since his passing, not only in continuing his legacy on many fronts, but doing so in a way that has actually meant so much for the Immigrant Justice Corps, so much for actual people close to Bob and the people in need that he devoted himself to helping. So thank you, Jennifer. I can honestly say that when Bob decided to take senior status, the single most thing he was excited about and talked about in detail was his coming collaboration with NYU Law School. And so it means a lot for me to be there, knowing that this was something he was talking about before even, his health deteriorated. And I'm just really, it's just been really great so far. I know I'm going to forget people, but, I want to thank Amy and Noah and the Katzman Fellows, Jamie, Catan, Alexander, Lily, and obviously Dean Troy McKenzie, and I'm sure I missed somebody, but thank you. I will say one thing, which is that, when somebody passes, and I've lost both my parents in the last 5 years, you hear a lot of comments and beyond. There was one thing somebody said to me once that really did stick with me. They said, just because a parent passes, just doesn't mean your relationship with them ends. And I thought about that because I thought about that there were so many moments when I was at a White House table and I was thinking to myself, oh man, if I speak up and make that point one more time, I'm gonna get so many eye rolls. I'm gonna, and then I could hear my dad saying to me, really? You're not gonna defend these people with disabilities because you're worried that you're gonna get a lot of eye rolls from your peers? And I would speak. And I realized I had those conversations with him when he was alive, but he wasn't actually there whispering in my ear. And I think that I am in a room full of people who are having those conversations with Bob quite often. Not just what would Bob do, but what would Bob advise? And so I can assure you that I had a lot of back and forth with Bob over what I should speak about tonight. And whenever I thought I was going to do something that would be a mistake, I could kind of imagine his eyes lighting up as he went, oh, and then he figured out some kind way to tell me that something was a bad idea. oh, yeah, that would be great, but what would really rivet them? So I hope he approves. So I did write my book, Economic Dignity, and one thing you should definitely come to me for advice is timing on books, because you definitely want to publish your book in May of 2020, because if you publish your book when bookstores are actually open and on the shelf, it's just too easy. I am going to take a moment to talk about this theme of the book I wrote, Economic Dignity, because it is more than a book to me. It is more of me deciding after decades, I guess I'm quite old, of policy making, that I really felt that in all the hurried policy making that happens, there actually ends up being a little too little time to actually think about what is the end goal of economic policy? What's the end goal of what we're here for? Now, this isn't like an indictment of people I've worked for. When you're in the middle of multiple crises, like right now, and the economy, the global security, the presidency's on the line, an interagency process on the meaning of life or economic policy might seem a little off, little off tenor, a little off note. But I came to truly believe that it was important, because what I really realized so much is that if you don't think about it, you start to confuse what are the economic means or metrics or tactics with what is your ultimate end goal. And so I decided that this was something I wanted to write about after I left the Obama White House. Now, I ended up writing that the end goal of economic policy should be economic dignity, which I defined in 3 parts. 1, do you have, through your economic effort, the capacity to care for the people you love and to be there for life's most precious moments, or equally precious moments for all people? 2, do you have a true first and second chance to pursue a sense of purpose and potential? And 3, are you able to work and contribute in the economy with respect as opposed to domination and humiliation? Now, I didn't just come to this. I really spent years thinking about it, and I have not, since I've written it, had any change. I feel this 3-part definition does reflect what so many, what I think should be a North Star, an economic justice principle for us. And I also felt, not to be starry-eyed or Don Quixote, these are not things that are unachievable or unaffordable. I mean, we cannot all take Roger Federer into the 5th set. We can't all be super rich. We can't all start for the Pistons or the Knicks. And we can't all be dean of NYU Law School, because you can only be dean of NYU Law School if your first name starts with TR and your last name starts with M. That's kind of a rule. So not everybody can achieve all of these things. Little inside NYU Law School humor. But these are things that it is possible to organize society in a way that everyone could achieve. Now, before telling you why I decided to go forward, I'll start with why it took me about 3 years to put this down on paper. Simply put, and I get to say this to a legal crowd where I can use the expression I like to use, I had incredible fear of Jacob Ellis versus Ohio risk. I had incredible, which many of you will know is the First Amendment case, which overturned the conviction of a theater owner for showing a French movie called The Lovers, and had lots of separate opinions. But Justice Potter Stewart, in his concurrence, infamously said, it wasn't hardcore pornography because, and here was his principled view, I know it when I see it. Now, for me or somebody in my world, this is a real fear. I pride myself and am part of a world of the National Economic Council policy making, which is based on rigor, data, and evidence. Testing ideas with the smartest people back and forth, rigorously challenging what's the bang for the buck, what's the evidence, what's the potential unintended consequences, is there a random controlled experiment that shows it definitely would work, everything that is about the opposite of I know it when I see it. And so I did have just an individual fear that too many of the people I respected in the world of rigor and data would say, what is this economic dignity? And yet I decided to go forward, even with that risk, personal risk, for a few reasons. One, when I myself would try to engage in this issue, I mean, just when I would go walk outside in the middle of the Clinton administration and think what we should push for the budget, et cetera, I would engage in my own mind in what I called the deathbed test. What would somebody say on their deathbed was the most important thing about their economic lives to their life? And it seemed to me that, and when I talked to people, I would feel that most people would kind of agree with my view. Were you able to care and provide for your loved ones? Were you able to kind of be there? Were you able to be bedside for your children when they were young and their parents when they were older? Could you not just provide food at the table, but be at the table? Did you feel you had a chance to pursue your potential and a chance of purpose? And when you went to work, and when were you with a team that respected you? or did you feel subject to domination and humiliation? And I would think to myself that I would not feel comfortable bringing that back to this rigorous economic advising group. But the more I thought about it is I should write this so that the next person in my situation doesn't feel uncomfortable doing that. Why should what matters most to you in your economic life, not on your deathbed, not inform our sense of what the ultimate end goals of economic policy was? The second thing that made me go forward was I saw how much over a few decades people confuse the end goals of policy and the means to policy. And I felt this a lot. I felt like I came into policy with a certain commitment from, development from my parents of justice, of social justice and economic justice, and that you looked at policies to see, did they best promote that ultimate vision? But what I saw in my world was, people locked into a trade view. 20 years later, they have the same view. They locked into a fiscal discipline view. And they talked about these things as if they were the end goal. It's our goal to have this fiscal percentage of the deficit. It's our goal to have this type of policy. And it was the end goal. There was no room for reflection in that. And it felt to me that this led to more tribalism policy-wise, more people gathering in groups, less listening to others, and less reflection of lessons learned, changes in technology, globalization. And so I really felt it was important to at least force people, or to at least empower somebody who is starting, when I started in my late 20s, to be able to make clear in their mind what is their end goal and what are the policy means that reach that, and whether it still works. Now, this seems a little strange in policy, but like imagine you're going to your doctor. Do you want your doctor to be like, man, I have had a very strong theoretical view that that prescription is the best for you, and I'm sticking with it? No, you want their end goal to be your health, and you want them to be willing to change with the evidence, because those are means to the end goal of your health. So that was the second reason I wanted to go forward. Third, a lot of policy making, to be honest, is not really about deciding what's good. It's about deciding what's most important. I think I spot David Keeman out there, who will verify that when you're sitting around a budget process, the majority of time of the debates you have are not about what is good or bad, but what is prioritized. With a limited budget, what should be prioritized? Where you have limits of money, of time, of political capital, what are you going to prioritize? And I will tell you that once you're in that White House, once you're going, it's going to be focused on what can get 60 votes, what can get 218 votes, what's the it policy of the moment, what's going to help you bridge different policy coalitions on your side or get an extra vote. Of course, but shouldn't you at least come to that table with a sense of why you might favor a particular policy over another? I think that's important, and I think there's much too little of it. And I'll tell you a sense of how this inquiry affected my views of some. Fourth was I wanted to shake up the dominant tendency of for people to see economic metrics themselves as the end goal of economic policy. Not as guideposts to help you judge progress, but as the end goal. Obviously, the most criticized view is GDP, growth. Growth is the end goal. And then, I'd love to say that we're all brilliantly criticizing that, but Robert F. Kennedy did a pretty good job 60 years ago of going through all the things GDP does not capture. But I wanted to explain why metrics, as important as they are, should not be confused with shouldn't confuse us or get mixed with what our ultimate end goals are. There is a joke about an inebriated man who is looking for house keys under a light post. Good Samaritan approaches the man and says, "Is this where you lost your keys?" And the inebriated man says, "Oh no, nowhere close, but this is the only place the light is shining." Bad joke, but good metaphor for economic policies. And Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler has been quoted repeatedly saying, "We spend more time looking at what we can measure as opposed to looking at what is most important." Now, the reaction of smart policy, economic policy guys is to have better metrics. Okay, GDP doesn't measure it, so we're going to find metrics that support fairness, show you more about distribution, and that is a really worthy, important goal. But even these have their limits, and it's important to see that. Consider the Gini coefficient. Take that one home with you. That is a measure of like how much inequality there is in a society. So you're kind of progressive, like I am, you'd like to see less inequality. There's another one, median wages. This became the big thing for progressives. We're going to focus on median wages. How does the typical worker doing in terms of their income? Again, a better measure. We have better unemployment measures like the U6, and we have better poverty measures. All of these are important improvements. But there is still something wrong and lost in seeing any of them as the end goal of policy. Take the Gini coefficient, all right? You don't have to really, you can forget all about it after this. But you can understand the following. If you have a country and their middle class completely collapses, the poor completely collapse, they go into poverty, their income falls 40%. But the top 10% saw their income fall 60%. The Gini coefficient gets better. That's not what you're rooting for. You'd say, well, no, that doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because 40 or 50 or 60% of the people fell further behind into poverty and despair, which tells you that is your actual end goal. And the Gini coefficient only tells you is a guidepost to the degree it meets an end goal that most of us in economic policy spend very, very little time thinking about. You know, in the Clinton administration in the last few years, this really was relevant because virtually every progressive economic metric was good. I mean, everyone. Poverty, black poverty, children's poverty, the bottom 20% gained more than the top 20%. I mean, you can just go through the whole list. Almost every metric was better. But what I realized a bit, and what is really, and I still believe, is that focusing on metrics alone, even the best metric, creates invisibility. Invisibility of real people, invisibility of real people's economic pain. And I sit there and think at the end of the 1990s, why didn't we focus on care workers? Why didn't we ask more about, was there major sexual harassment at work? Well, because all the metrics were good. None of those would actually be measured by a metric. If maybe we had come in with a view that economic dignity was the end goal, could we have done a lot with an all-Republican Congress? Probably not. But it would have realistically changed the way we looked at economic policy. And when I think of some of the things that's kind of made some of these issues that I speak of more prevalent, it really wasn't a better use of metrics. It really was the pandemic. You know, I thought the pandemic was quite interesting. So many people in the middle class, upper middle class, suffered really painful harms that you can't necessarily put a number on. They missed the birth of a granddaughter, graduations. And I experienced what a lot of people did, which was I was not able to be by my mother's side when she passed in June of 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. And these were considered exquisite pains that people wrote about quite a bit. Yet, these are the pains of not being able to care for family and be there at life's most precious moments that tens and tens and tens of millions of people experience every day, even if we don't measure it properly. Do you know that 1 in 8 women, 1 in 8, can't take 1 week off after the birth of a child? Do you know that it is standard normal policy in almost every company and institution in our country that when the worst thing in the world happens in your life, the death of a spouse or a child, the worst thing that happens, executives get paid time off and the rank and file don't? I mean, think about that. Really? Even for that, our economic lives affect this. You go through a sickness, whether it's Bob or my parents, it's not like one day. It goes on and on. I mean, I had examples in my book of people who went to incredible levels to be by their parent while they had heart surgery. Their boss was going to fire them. They left and couldn't take time off, and then they made it there. But then there were 4 more surgeries after that, and they weren't there when their parent died. It happens all the time. It may not be focused on a metric, but the fact is that one of the beautiful equalities of life is that for all the riches you have and all the honors you have, there are certain things in one's personal and family life that tend to be the most precious for everyone. And there is really no economic reason we could not afford to make sure that on that first principle of can you care for family and be there, that everyone could have those. And when I think about that, yeah, it did change my ordering of priorities. It makes me rise up a little higher paid family leave for poor people, and not just for when they have a child or adopt a child, but when their parents are passing away. Are you there? That is more important goal for me by thinking through this. Let's be honest. Why do we focus on gig workers right now? Gig workers, they don't really have good health benefits. They don't have a security. Their median wage, their wage could go up, but they live very precarious lives. Why? Because we started using Uber. We did. And other things where people delivered us stuff. And we discovered gig workers and their issues. I mean, there's nothing new about gig workers. Do you think taxi cab drivers had secure economic lives and benefits? They didn't. How about care workers? How about your domestic person who cares for your children and cleans your house? Do they have any rights at work? They don't, right? Because after the New Deal, Southern politicians excluded them along with farm workers. All these things get lost from a metrics point of view, but are understood when you look at economic dignity as being your ultimate goal. What really kills me in economics is we don't even recognize something as an economic issue unless it's connected to an economic metric. I mean, it was a great thing. People started writing about 20 years ago, childcare is an economic issue. You know why? Because people started doing analysis that said childcare affected labor market participation. And female labor market participation among prime workers 25 to 54 was a major economic issue. Therefore, it's an economic issue. I mean, tens and tens of millions of people would say their number one issue in their economic life is figuring out how to work and care for their families. But it's only an economic issue. It's not even dignified as an economic issue until you can connect it. I don't think we do a lot of meetings on economic policy shops on sexual abuse at work. I mean, but maybe somebody will come up with a study showing it reduces productivity. Then it's an economic issue. No, it shouldn't be. So let me be clear. None of this is an escape from rigor. None of this is escape from evidence. But it's like when you're traveling. You still got to have directions. You still got to use the GPS. But it helps to know where you think you're going, what your North Star is, what your ultimate goal is going to be. And I will say that since I get to speak to all these judges and legal people today, that I do not find this separate from areas of law and constitutional law. I mean, I'm speaking at the law school connected to the center named for Justice Brennan. It was Justice Brennan who used to say if you asked him to define the Constitution in one word, it would be dignity. It was Justice Brennan who, when asked to define the Constitution, said a sparkling vision of the supremacy of human dignity of every individual, and that in Goldberg versus Kelly wrote, the nation's basic commitment has been to foster dignity and well-being of all its people. And indeed, Justice Kennedy, in his major opinions on marital, the right to marry who you love, refers constantly. He uses dignity 10 times in striking down the Defense of Marriage Act, and concludes that those who seek to marry same-sex partners are asking only for the equal dignity in the eyes of the law under the 14th Amendment. Now, I don't mean to, I'm not going to enter into a, substantive due process or, expanding rights view, but I do think that the area that I did focus on some when I did publish is an example of where a lack of focus on the end goal has been extremely detrimental, and that is the Equal Protection Clause. There is very little question in my mind and the minds of many people, and I would guess Joel Motley would say in the eyes of his late mother, that the Equal Protection Clause was fundamentally to protect the extraordinary dignity harms created by second-class citizen and legally sanctioned caste. Like slavery, the laws of Jim Crow operated to exactly deny a person the capacity to care for their family, to pursue purpose and potential, and to work without humiliation and domination. This was the ultimate focus of dignity. And yet, as time went on, we went to not a metric, but a test. If you use race at all, you go through the same strict scrutiny, you have to show compelling purpose, narrow division, as if it was all the same. We started laying the foundation for the color blindness right now, which literally turns the ultimate goal of the Equal Protection Clause on its head. So a part of our Constitution that was specifically designed to prevent the majority from relegating a minority to a second-class citizenship and a loss of economic dignity becomes the blocker for measures to ensure economic dignity and equal equal citizenship for all. It is really kind of a stunning event of what happens when one allows the law or economics to develop in a way where you lose sight of what your fundamental end goal would be. Finally, I want to say that an end goal like economic dignity is, for me, also, in a sense, a rule of justice. Now, I thought about a lot this when I was doing my book, and I kind of thought if I really wanted to make sure that in addition to the pandemic, nobody, only this many people looked at my book, I would try to write about how it intersected or didn't intersect with Rawls or Sandel, et cetera. No offense to them, but I was looking for a wider audience and speaking as people thought of the economy. But I do think honestly of economic dignity as, in a sense, not just an end goal, but a rule of justice. So if Rawls' difference principle is seen as constraining inequality in the sense that when you look at a particular policy, you want to essentially make sure that the worst among us rise at least as much and hopefully a little more than the best among us. That's kind of the principle. And I find it kind of interesting that the most conservative people in our country actually kind of feel that they have to give lip service to it, though those who promote trickle-down economics, I think, rarely quote John Rawls. But in this sense, but let me give a sense in which I think you can think of this as a rule of justice, a rule of economic justice. And that is one that I have struggled with a lot in my life, and that is over issues like trade policy. Now, Michael Waldman, others who've been around these tables would tell you that there is a very utilitarian kind of nature to the discussion. You're going to lower trade barriers, you're going to increase competition and lower prices, and it's going to benefit everybody a little. And it's going to benefit everybody a little enough that even if you compensated, here's my least favorite expression in economic policy, compensated the losers, we would all still be net better off. I will say that this kind of discussion has dominated at many progressive tables as well as conservative tables. And yet what we've seen from economic policy, what we've seen is that it's not like you have just a little bit of harm for some people and everybody benefits a little. It's much different than that. And I don't mean in a time where people are concerned about inflation and costs to in any way minimize the importance of lowering prices. But the harm that people suffered was not a small economic harm. When communities went down, you saw people lose everything. You saw a cycling down of communities and people that devastated them, devastated their families, devastated their futures, led to more depression, more suicide, less children, more divorce. And I have really come to the opinion that we do need to have a basic floor of dignity in our policies. And that's what we should do. But if we can't, then maybe we shouldn't go forward. Think about a family with 5 children. Somebody came up and said to someone, hey, I got a great plan. 4 of your kids are going to have significantly higher income for a few years. Your 5th kid, they'll be completely devastated. They'll become an alcoholic. They'll cycle down and probably live in depression. There's no loving parent who would take that deal. But yet I think a lot of people in our country feel that that's the deal that's been taken, that you're willing to benefit everyone, and that if they can suffer so much, then they're not part of the family, they're not part of the national family, they're not part of the community. If you have essentially, if you think of dignity, economic dignity, as not just an end goal, but kind of a floor, a rule of justice floor that you have, then it's not that you don't go forward, but you do so in ways that make sure you have dignity for all. So, a tangible example, we was very proud in my Biden life to help develop something called a domestic conversion policy. Now, President Biden is very good on this issue. He would say to us during the campaign, I don't want you doing any policies that feel to people like, hey, 5 younger people in a different city or state are going to do really well, but you, factory worker, are going to be devastated and all your dreams will be dashed. And so does that mean we become Luddites, we hold up change? No. We have a policy now where we give extra significant incentives to someone who does a transition to electric vehicles, but reinvest in the community where the plant would close. They retool, they revitalize, and they rehire. Now that doesn't stop technological change, but it's designed in a way that ensures that we're not doing something that just benefits the masses or everyone, but where we tell a small group or a not so small group that it's okay for them to be devastated and that we don't really care. One of the things that I will that I wanted to hit before I leave is just that one of Bob's ideas was having a working group from these, something constructive that happened afterwards. And I would keep you here for another 20 minutes going through more examples from our administration, but I want to mention a few things that I think are worth thinking about. One of the things that we focused on exactly was this issue of scarring, the type of economic harms that stay with people and lead to downward cycles. We underestimate this in economic policy making. And it's one of the few economic phrases that kind of makes sense. You're scarred. Not everybody recovers in a recovery. Most people do. Their bank account goes back, they get a job. But the people I talked about in communities that spiral down, people long-term unemployed, people evicted, people who lose their home, the fact is many of them never recover. They lose their health, their house, their spouse. They never recover. Proud of the fact that in our American Rescue Plan, which President Biden asked me to administer, that we had such a focus not only on the general numbers, but on preventing the scarring, on helping the long-term unemployed, on having the first ever policy to prevent evictions. And I'm proud that when we asked and challenged law schools around this country to use their law schools and their law students to help more people who were facing evictions, NYU Law School was one of the places that stood up and responded. I think as a working group, I think it is good for us to take a look both in law and legal representation in those areas where people's harms are of a different nature. I could read you chapter and verse of the harm of eviction, multi-generational. How many families break up? How many kids never catch up from school? It's, you know, Joe Biden likes to say, the longest walk is the walk of a parent up the stairs to tell his family that he's been laid off. Well, I have to think an even longer walk is to walk up the stairs and tell your children, we're leaving our house and I don't know where we're gonna go. You want to talk about an assault on the sense of being able to care for your family. These things have made a difference. They make a difference in economic dignity in people's lives. So I think looking at the places on long-term unemployment, the degree that long-term unemployment is not a specific class, but there is no question there is discrimination in hiring against people who've been unemployed for a certain amount of time, which leads to more harm. Evictions, the difference. Look, sometimes you have to evict somebody. You know, I have a friend whose tenant killed their dog. You know, it's a good reason to evict. But the difference in evictions between people are represented in court versus people who are not is very similar to what Bob Katzman found as the difference between people who are represented in immigration cases, not undocumented Americans in cases. When that is the case, there is a real role for the law and economic dignity in preventing economic scarring. You know, it's funny, as I do this, I was looking for all these quotes from Bob that I would use, but, you know, in some ways, you know, Bob kind of just personified dignity and a defense of other people's dignity. I was going to read from his different lines, but I just am still struck by when he first told me about his idea of the Immigrant Justice Corps. He said, I sit here on the bench and I look at people and they have been represented so poorly that there is nothing I can do as a person who honors the rule of law to save them. And I can't sleep at night. And it wasn't because they would suffer a little harm here or there. It was because he exactly saw parents who would be removed from their family, children who would go through the most ultimate harm and pain. It was in every way the type of deep harm that you cannot necessarily quantify. You cannot assign a metric to it, but you know is an assault on the fundamental dignity of a person to care for their family and be there. And so I'm very honored to be here with Bob. He was very clear with me that he approved of me talking about economic dignity. And I'm happy to stay here as long as anybody wants to talk with me or eat dinner with me. Thank you.
So we're going to, I'm just going to use the time remaining to take this opportunity, since I have Gene Sperling here. Did you know I have Gene Sperling right here? To ask a question, and then maybe we could see if there are any questions from the floor.
By the way, I always used to get the question, is the real West Wing different from the fake West Wing? And my answer was similar to yours. I would say, yes, we just don't walk as fast. We don't walk as much, we don't talk as fast, and we're not as, we don't walk as fast, we're not as funny, and we're not as good looking. So that was, other than that, it was quite realistic.
Okay, I'm not going to comment on any of those. So
You think me and Rob Lowe kind of, we're okay?
Again,
Thank you. I agree. Yeah,
I've
thanks.
learned as dean, you
My
just
late
don't
mother
comment.
agrees with you,
You just
so.
don't comment. Something you said struck me, which was invoking David Kamen. You talked about what are you going to prioritize?
Yeah.
And in your current role administering the American Rescue Plan, that's something you've got to think about.
Yes.
And frankly, in any kind of serious economic policy, you've got to think about. So I wanted to ask you sort of a blended question and bring in the law, because with the eviction moratorium, for example, that
Right.
went to the Supreme Court, and then the court ended up finding it invalid. And I wanted to ask you, how do you know what to prioritize? You've got values, but
Right.
you've also got political reality, deeply divided political culture. You've got legal considerations. You've got the court. How do you even start to know what's first, and how do I even formulate what my priorities are going to be?
Well, I think the American Rescue Plan was obviously an enormous challenge, and probably there's never been a program where you had to set up more new emergency programs so quickly. And we were inheriting a gigantic amount of fraud in 3 programs from the previous administration, and all of those were things you had to deal with. But I do think that for me personally, I think ensuring that the refundable child tax credit, which was passed on March 11th, that would actually go out for the first time to 40 million families monthly, 4 months later. I think I felt like if that didn't succeed, if we had an affordable care moment there, that everything else I did would not matter as much, because that was so fundamental.
Just as a matter of execution.
Yes.
A matter of execution.
As execution, yes. And then I think on the emergency rental assistance, I think that was the scariest. I think that was the moment that, you always say something kept you up at night. I think I thought about that to the moment I went to sleep. I woke up thinking about it in the middle of the night. That's not really why people 65 wake up in the middle of the night. But when I woke up for other reasons, I thought about it. And I worried about it in the morning. And it was for the reasons that I talked about. It's just heart-wrenching. Like, losing a job is bad, but many people get through it. Being evicted, having to tell your children you're going out, and the thought that it could be massive. Remember the experts, Matthew Desmond, Diane Yuntal, others, they all basically told us that the moratorium had essentially reduced, people who wanted, landlords who wanted to evict so much, that there would be an incredible pent-up demand to evict, and that you would be imagining like a Great Depression-like scene. And I think that just led us to say that that was the single most important thing that we could get right on the execution. Now, you know, again, when you talk about economic dignity, et cetera, you go up. You know, I can't say enough that having a focus on what's most important and how you reach that is not an excuse for not having smart policy. And the reality is a moratorium could only last so long. I mean, you have real live, I'm sure in this group there are real live people who have real live middle-class families who rent apartments. And it wasn't like completely fair to say they should take the whole economic burden. But the emergency rental assistance said, you work with us to keep people in the home and we will pay the rent. That was the right way to share cost for a goal that was very important for economic dignity. And so I do think that that, to me, in some ways was, you know, the most special type of thing. And I think you know, again, in life, there's things you have to do, have good anti-fraud controls, and then there's things you feel morally compelled to do. And I think, you know, one of the reasons for a person like myself to want to take a job like that is to make sure the things that would matter most to economic dignity and families was put at the top of the priority list.
So I think, why don't we take one or two questions? Any questions from the floor? Yes.
I guess I would like an address where we could share our ideas with you. So it's going to be a short kind of evening from now on. I have a couple ideas, but I don't want to get in the way of other people's ideas.
Well, here's, you know, I only have one email address at the White House. I don't have like a special, I don't have like a special, I have one email address at the White House. It is Eugene.b.Sperling, Eugene.b.Sperling at who.eop.gov. I always offer people the opportunity to write me directly, and it's funny, few people take you up on it. My assistants all go, oh no, you've given out your email address. It's over for us. We'll be swamped. But again, eugene.b.sperling at who.eop.gov. But don't ever call me actual Eugene in life. That's just what I have to put on, because it's on my birth certificate.
Another question. Yes.
Thank you for your remarks this evening. Yes, one question I had is, when you talk about setting the floor of economic dignity, what is the way that you go about choosing how to structure that? So I think some of the problems you mentioned certainly are solved through fiscal policy or, you know, massive legislation like the American Rescue Plan, but also other themes you talked about implicated labor law. You might implicate, you know, administrative agencies
Right.
like the EEOC or NLRB. I also think of like executive orders, et cetera. So how do you navigate choosing what is the way you structure the kind of, you know, floor you're seeking to set?
Right, and to me, that is why I would feel to myself what is most important. You know, look, I think there is inevitably a bit of elitism and disconnection, often from people doing policy. I think it's important to, you know, have people from a diversity of backgrounds, both economic and otherwise. And I think it's important to listen. You know, one of the things, Chris Hughes is here, founded the Economic Security Project. We did a weekly call with the advocates on the child tax credit. We did a weekly call that the National Low Income Housing Group would sponsor with the people on the ground. I think part of the metrics kind of aloofness is sometimes not really grasping the pain, again, the invisibility of other people's pain. And I really do feel like the pandemic, you know, when people started writing about, oh my God, I can't do this, I can't do that, it was a little bit like the like the upper middle class kind of discovering what everybody was going through. We also kind of discovered, oh, wow, you know, that person caring for your mother while you can't visit them because of COVID is about like the most important person in your entire life. And just kind of go by day after day, paying them like shit and not providing, you know, I mean, the stories repeatedly of people caring for our kids and parents who couldn't take off any time to take for their kids and their parents, that to me, I think, is part of the invisibility. And I think, look, I mean, having a good North Star, you know, I mean, my North Star is to take Roger Federer into the fifth set at Wimbledon. Having that North Star doesn't mean you're going to reach it or that it's easy, but I do think it is helpful, and I do feel a little bit like it does make me prioritize more things that you know, affect people's work dignity. You know, Elizabeth Anderson at University of Michigan talks about private government. You know, the idea that you have rights, but like, you know, you're awake so many hours a day, and then like a good chunk of those days, if somebody can arbitrarily tell you what to say, what to do, like how much do you really have that in your daily life? So I do think that, you know, this is a constant conversation, but I just find it's helpful to be thinking that way instead of like, we were for this legislation, you know, 20 years ago, we're still for it, or we have this policy stance 20 years from now. And I do think that I do think that this makes me think a lot more about how people are treated at work, where they spend a huge amount of their lives, and their capacity for being able to enjoy like the basic, you know, loves of life that really are not unaffordable. You know, somebody comes to me right now, I think, you know, says, oh, can we just build everybody a $300,000 house? You know, that would help economic dignity a lot, but you could crater the economy and you could have all sorts of problems. But so many of the things we're talking about could be done. One thing I'll just say on the minimum wage. The way the minimum wage is the state of nature is there is no minimum wage. And then if you want to say that a person who works full-time should be able to care for their family, you better come ready. Are you sure it's not going to deter jobs from being created? Are you sure it's, you know, not going to deter people? I mean, they're all good questions, but it's like the state of nature is kind of you're all on your own, and you know, it's okay. Some people work 50 hours a week and, you know, can't provide any security for their children. But you know, it's funny, in Wealth of Nation, Adam Smith very specifically says the people who provide for others must be able to provide for their family. That never got as much mileage as the invisible hand. But, you know, that's right in there. Now, if you thought about that as a floor, as a guide, it doesn't mean you necessarily have a $25 minimum wage or a $30 minimum wage. It doesn't necessarily mean you'd have, you know, you'd write checks to everybody, or you know, you'd have the biggest EITC, but you would be forced to, around that table of rigor, figure out how we meet that basic floor. And you would still be able to have a great economy, and you would still be able to have a market incentive economy, but you would do it with a floor that if people work full-time, they should not have to raise their children in despair and poverty and insecurity.
So, Gene, I just want to say, I don't know why you have to make this so hard. You want to take Federer to 5 sets. I want to beat him 6-love in 3 sets. And that's you know, that's.
did take him to 5 sets.
They did.
And
Okay.
It wasn't pretty, so that's not, you know, the best.
With that, I'm going to call time. I want to thank you for an extraordinarily stimulating conversation and for framing a lot of things that are really far beyond the metrics in a way that puts a perspective that we all need to hear, especially those of us who think analytically within the law, within policy circles. This has really been amazing. So please join me in thanking Gene Sperling.